Space is just the ultimate high-stakes workplace. I mean, up there, hundreds of kilometers above us, one simple, clumsy moment, something you wouldn't even blink at down here, well, it can turn into a massive, massive headache. And this story, it all kicks off with this one single chilling sentence that came crackling over the radio. Imagine hearing this. Peggy, I don't have a shield. Just like that. That's the voice of astronaut share³, and he's in the middle of a spacewalk back in 2017. And his partner, Peggy Whitson, her reply says it all. What? You can just hear the surprise, right? This wasn't just, oops, I dropped a screwdriver. No, this was the start of a very real and very fast-moving problem. So, let's picture this. It's March 2017. Kimbrough and Whitson are outside the International Space Station. They're in the middle of this 6.5-hour spacewalk, and they're doing some really complex, meticulous work, prepping a docking port. And then, poof, something just floats away. And you really got to get a sense of the scale here. We are not talking about a little dropped wrench. This was a fabric shield, okay? It weighed about 8 kilograms, and it was the size of a car door. A car door. And Mission Control is just watching it on the cameras, just drifting away at about half a foot per second. The thing is, this wasn't just some random piece of cloth. No, it had a really, really important job. So what they lost was something called a Whipple shield, and it's this brilliantly clever piece of engineering. It's not just about blocking space junk head-on. No, it uses the junk's own incredible speed against it. See, the thin outer layers, they make an incoming piece of debris shatter into this cloud of tiny, much less dangerous fragments. It spreads out all that impact energy so the main wall of the spacecraft can handle it. No problem. It's basically a super smart piece of armor. So, okay, this critical shield is now officially space junk itself. What do you do? Well, the team on Earth scrambled. I mean, they have exact replicas of everything on the ISS, right? So they got to work and figured out this improvised solution for the astronauts, using wire ties and another piece of fabric to cover up that exposed port. It was definitely a temporary fix, but man, what a testament to how prepared these folks are for pretty much anything. And, this whole incident, it's just a perfect illustration of how incredibly challenging these spacewalks, or EVAs as they're called, really are. It's not just floating around and looking at the view. Oh no, it's about doing really complex mechanical work in probably the most unforgiving environment you can imagine. I love this quote from veteran astronaut Drew Fustel, because he just puts it perfectly. He says it's like wearing a set of mechanics gloves with a pair of thick welding gloves pulled right over them. Just try to imagine that. Trying to handle tiny nuts and bolts and tethers with that setup. You have almost zero tactile feedback. You can't feel what you're doing. You just have to trust your training and go for it. And speaking of training, the amount of practice astronauts get these days has changed a lot. Back in the space shuttle era, for every 1 hour they were going to spend on a real spacewalk, they'd train for 10 hours in NASA's huge underwater pool. 10 to 1. Today, that ratio is down to 2 or maybe 3 to 1. That is a massive drop in practice time for one of the hardest jobs in or out of this world. So how do you stop things and, people from just floating away? Well, everything gets tethered. Astronauts have these long retractable cables to move around the station and then smaller local tethers to keep themselves and their tools locked down while they're working. The number one rule of a spacewalk is simple. Every single item that goes out the door has to be attached to something. But, as we're about to see, even with all those rules, the system isn't always foolproof. Okay, so this story gets even more interesting. Fast forward a year to 2018, and there's another incident. But this time, the object they lost was way, way smaller. But the consequences? Well, they were surprisingly bigger. So it's Drew Fustel again, and he's on his 9th spacewalk. This time, he loses a single wire tie. Like a big, heavy-duty garbage tie. What happened was the jaws of the tether it was clipped to just failed to close all the way. And because his feet were locked into a restraint, there was absolutely nothing he could do. He just had to watch it float away and call it in to Mission Control. Okay, so here's where it gets really fascinating. You've got this giant car door-sized shield on one hand and this tiny little wire tie on the other. Which one is the bigger problem? You think the shield, right? Wrong. It was the complete opposite. See, that big shield was actually pretty light for its size, so the Earth's atmosphere dragged it out of orbit relatively quickly. That tiny wire tie, though, that caused a major, major issue. And this led to a historic moment, but not the good kind. For the first time ever, a satellite had to actually fire its thrusters to get out of the way of a free-floating object that an astronaut had dropped. That little wire tie that Foista lost was on a direct collision course with another very expensive satellite, forcing this totally unprecedented evasive action. So you see, these individual mistakes, as dramatic as they are, they're really just a tiny, tiny part of a much bigger problem. The space right around our planet, it's getting seriously crowded, and we've been accumulating junk up there for more than 60 years now. I mean, think about it. Ever since Sputnik went up in 1957, we've been leaving stuff behind in orbit. By 1979, it was already a serious enough problem that NASA had to create a whole program just to track it all. And today, we're monitoring this massive, massive field of debris, everything from old dead satellites to tiny little flecks of paint. Okay, let's try to wrap our heads around the sheer scale of this, because it's kind of mind-blowing. Right now, the U.S. Space Surveillance Network is actively tracking about 23,000 objects. These are things larger than a softball. Every single one is cataloged, its orbit is watched, as it just whips around the planet at thousands of miles per hour. But get this, that's just the stuff we can easily track. Once you go smaller, say down to the size of a marble, that number jumps to an estimated 500,000. And you have to remember, at orbital speeds, even a tiny marble hits with the destructive energy of a bowling ball flying down the highway. And then you get to the threats that are pretty much invisible, the ones we can't reliably track. We're talking an estimated 100 million fragments that are 1 millimeter or larger. Just picture a cloud of sand, but every single grain is a potential bullet. This is why that Whipple shield we talked about earlier is so absolutely critical for keeping astronauts safe. So, with all that junk flying around, how does the International Space Station stay safe? Well, it relies on this really strict warning system. The easiest way to think about it is like a giant 50-kilometer pizza box drawn in space around the station. If any piece of tracked debris is predicted to fly into that box, it triggers an alert. A yellow warning means the controllers on the ground start planning a maneuver just in case. But a red warning, that means the ISS has to move, no questions asked. And we have a perfect, real-world example of this system in action. Back in 2012, the Fermi Gamma Ray Space Telescope got one of these alerts. The prediction, it was going to pass within just 200 meters of an old, dead Russian spy satellite. So what did they do? They fired the thrusters for just 1 second. That's it. A tiny little push was all it took to move it safely out of the way and prevent a really catastrophic collision. You know, bringing it all back to the human element, there's a real sense of professional pride at stake here. I love how Drew Feustel puts it. You lose style points for losing things in space. I mean, that's not exactly something you want to be known for as an astronaut, right? And there's a real weight that comes with these mistakes. Feustel later reflected on it, saying that up until he lost that wire tie, he had a perfect record. But now he says he has to live with the knowledge that he made his own small contribution to that cloud of debris, another object floating up there in space that just shouldn't be. And all of this, it leaves us with a really critical question for the future. We're jumping headfirst into a new space age, right? With plans to launch tens of thousands of new satellites for these huge mega constellations. So in this sky that's getting more crowded by the day, how are we going to manage the traffic? How are we going to manage the risks? And those inevitable human errors that just keep adding to the problem? That right there is the challenge we all now face.